Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where the darkest tales from America's forgotten past are unearthed. Tonight, we delve into a story from the quiet hills of Vermont, a chilling account. The year is 1869, and what lies beneath the floorboards of the Grady family barn will haunt your dreams for years to come. On any modern map of Vermont, the small town of Blackwood Hollow does not appear, perhaps for good reason. This once thriving community became the setting for one of New England's most disturbing discoveries in the autumn of 1869. But to understand what was hidden beneath those weathered barn floorboards, we must first understand the Grady family themselves. In the spring of 1853, Jeremiah Grady arrived in Vermont. He was a man of considerable means and a mysterious background. Some said his fortune had been made in shipping along the eastern seaboard. Others whispered of darker ventures in the Caribbean. What is known is that he purchased Blackwood Hollow's largest property, 500 acres of rolling farmland with views of the Green Mountains, and he set about building a life that appeared idyllic from the outside. Jeremiah explained that many were the offspring of soldiers who had fallen in battle, and it was his patriotic duty to provide for them. The community, while finding the situation unusual, generally applauded the family's generosity. Martha Wilson, who served as the town school teacher from 1862 to 1867, had this to say. The Grady children, as we called them, rarely attended school with any regularity. When questioned, Mr. Grady explained that he provided education at home, believing the standard curriculum insufficient. The few who did attend were quiet, well-mannered, and reluctant to speak of their life at the farm. They appeared healthy, if somewhat thin, and were always withdrawn from classes at the first sign of illness. It's important to note that during this period, formal adoption procedures were virtually non-existent, and the taking in of orphans was often an informal arrangement, particularly in rural areas. There were no agencies overseeing such situations, and a man of Jeremiah's standing would have faced few questions about his charitable endeavors. By 1865, as the Civil War drew to a close, something changed at the Grady farm. The family became increasingly reclusive. Jeremiah was rarely seen in town, sending farm hands to conduct business on his behalf. Constance, once a regular at Sunday services, stopped attending church altogether. The Grady children, both biological and adopted, vanished from public view. When questioned, Jeremiah cited concerns about a mysterious illness. "My wife fears the children may contract something dreadful in town," he told the general store owner, William Hayes. "We find it best to keep them close to home until the danger passes." This explanation satisfied most of the townspeople, who were accustomed to periodic outbreaks of disease and the isolation that often followed. What few noticed, however, was that while no children were seen leaving the Grady property, new faces continued to arrive. Always under cover of night, always in a covered wagon driven by Jeremiah himself. Then came the spring of 1868 when the Grady farm experienced a terrible tragedy. A fire broke out in the family's main house, supposedly started by a knocked-over lantern. By the time neighbors noticed the flames and arrived to help, the structure was engulfed. Jeremiah, Constance, and their two biological children escaped unharmed. Of the orphans, there was no sign. They were safely relocated to the barn when the fire began, Jeremiah explained to those who asked. "We had noticed a weakness in the chimney days earlier and moved the children as a precaution. The Lord guided our actions." The house was rebuilt by autumn, a near-identical structure rising from the ashes of the old, but something had shifted in Jeremiah Grady. A man changed was how those who encountered him described him. His once robust frame had thinned. His hair had gone completely gray, and his eyes held a haunted quality that made people uncomfortable. Constance was rarely seen at all following the fire. Rumors circulated that the event had affected her nerves, leaving her bedridden and unstable. The few who glimpsed her reported that she had taken to wearing only white and would stare silently out of the upstairs windows for hours at a time. As for the orphans, they seemed to have vanished entirely. When Reverend Carter inquired about their welfare, Jeremiah explained that they had been sent to live with relatives or placed in proper orphanages now that the war had ended. It became too much for my dear wife, he told the Reverend. Her health could not sustain the constant demands of so many young souls. We did what was best for all concerned. For a year, life in Blackwood Hollow returned to a semblance of normalcy. The Gradys kept to themselves, and gradually the gossip surrounding them faded. The farm continued to operate, though on a reduced scale with fewer hands employed and less produce brought to market. Then came the autumn of 1869 and the discovery that would forever alter the community's understanding of the quiet family on the hill. It began with the well. In late September, several farms in the area reported problems with their water. An unusual taste, a faint odor that couldn't quite be identified. The local doctor, Horace Fleming, advised boiling all drinking water as a precaution against contamination. The source was eventually traced to a small stream that ran down from the direction of the Grady property. 3 men from town, William Hayes, the store owner, James Collins the blacksmith, and Peter Lawson, a farmer whose land adjoined the Gradys, decided to follow the stream to its source to identify the contamination. Their path led them directly to the Grady barn. We noticed it before we even reached the structure, James Collins later recounted. A terrible smell like nothing I've encountered before. Sweet and putrid all at once. We thought perhaps an animal had died and been improperly buried. The men approached the barn, intending to speak with Jeremiah about the situation. Finding no one in the vicinity, they entered the structure, calling out as they did so. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. The barn, so unusually constructed, was nearly empty. No livestock, no hay, no farming implements, just an open space with that peculiar floor. And in one corner, a section of the floorboards had been pried up, revealing dark, damp soil beneath. But it was the smell that drove the men forward, compelling them to investigate further, despite their growing unease. Peter Lawson, using a shovel that had been left nearby, began to dig into the exposed earth. He hadn't gone more than 2 foot down when he struck something, William Hayes recalled. Something that made a sound no dirt should make. We cleared away more of the soil and found. Dear God, we found a small hand, a child's hand, partially decomposed, but unmistakable. The men fled the barn and rode immediately to fetch Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, a distant relative of the town's founder and a man known for his level head in crisis. The sheriff, along with Dr. Fleming and several deputies, returned to the Grady property before nightfall. What they uncovered over the next 3 days defies comprehension. Beneath the carefully constructed floor of the barn lay the remains of 42 children buried in layers, some having been there for what appeared to be years, others more recently interred. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, but all appeared to be between the ages of 4 and 12. It was a scene from hell itself, Dr. Fleming wrote in his journal. The manner in which they were arranged suggested a terrible methodical nature to these burials. They were placed in concentric circles, radiating outward from the center of the barn. Most troubling of all, each child had been positioned with their hands crossed over their chest as if laid to rest with care. The sheriff immediately sought to locate the Grady family, but the farmhouse stood empty. Jeremiah, Constance, and their 2 children had vanished. Their personal belongings remained, suggesting a hasty departure. Most chilling of all was what the search party found in Jeremiah's study, a leather-bound ledger containing names, dates, and amounts. It appears to be a record of transactions, Sheriff Blackwood noted in his official report. Names of children, dates of arrival, and sums of money. The most recent entry was dated just 3 weeks prior, a boy named Samuel, age 6, for the sum of $15. As the investigation expanded, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The Gradys had not been taking in orphans out of charity. They had been purchasing children from orphanages, from desperate parents, from unscrupulous individuals who trafficked in human misery. But why? What purpose did these children serve? And what led to their burial beneath the barn? The answers came from an unexpected source. 2 days after the discovery, as the town reeled from the horror unfolding in their midst, a young woman arrived in Blackwood Hollow. She identified herself as Ruth Collins, formerly Ruth Grady, Jeremiah's daughter from a previous marriage, long estranged from her father. "I received a letter," she told Sheriff Blackwood, "a letter from my stepmother, Constance, sent 3 weeks ago. It contained only the words, 'Save them if you can,' and the name of this town. I came as quickly as possible, but it appears I am too late." Ruth revealed a history few in Blackwood Hollow could have imagined. Jeremiah Grady, she explained, had not made his fortune in shipping or trade. He had been a doctor of sorts, an experimenter interested in the extremes of human physiology, particularly in children, whose bodies he believed held secrets to extending life indefinitely. "My father was obsessed with the idea that children possess a vital energy that diminishes with age," Ruth explained. "He conducted experiments, terrible, unthinkable experiments, attempting to harness this energy. I fled his home when I was 16 after witnessing what he did to 2 young siblings he had claimed to adopt. I tried to alert authorities in Boston, but without evidence who would believe such accusations against a respected man." According to Ruth, Jeremiah had continued his work for years in various locations, always moving when suspicions arose. Blackwood Hollow with its isolation and trusting community had provided him the perfect cover to expand his efforts. "The barn was his laboratory," she said. "The children were kept there, not in the house. That's why no one saw them after their initial arrival. The fire at the house was likely set deliberately. A diversion to explain the absence of the children when questions eventually arose. But what of Constance and the Grady children, Abigail and Thomas?" Ruth's explanation chilled even the hardened sheriff. "Constance was not my father's wife, but his assistant, a woman equally consumed by the pursuit of immortality. Their children, my half-siblings, were not exempt from their experiments. I believe my stepmother finally broke under the weight of their crimes. Her letter to me suggests a fracture in their shared purpose." The search for the Grady family extended beyond Vermont into neighboring states and as far south as Pennsylvania. Descriptions were circulated, rewards offered. But Jeremiah, Grady, Constance, and their children had vanished completely. Some speculated they had fled to Europe or even further afield, where Jeremiah might continue his unspeakable work. Others, noting the careful way the barn had been left partially exposed, wondered if perhaps Constance had enacted her own justice, burying Jeremiah alongside his victims, and then taking her own life and those of her children in some remote location. The truth remains unknown. The bodies of the 42 children were carefully exhumed and given proper burials in the Blackwood Hollow Cemetery. A monument was erected, bearing no names, for most remained unidentified, but simply the inscription, "For the children. May they find in heaven the peace denied them on earth." In the months following the discovery, several residents of Blackwood Hollow reported strange phenomena around the former Grady property, lights seen moving in the abandoned barn at night, the sounds of children's laughter carried on the wind. A small figure in white, possibly a girl, standing at the edge of the property before vanishing when approached. By the spring of 1870, the town had made a decision. The barn was dismantled. Each piece of wood burned to ash. The farmhouse was similarly destroyed. The land was sown with salt, a symbolic gesture to purify what had been tainted. No crops have grown there since. Blackwood Hollow itself began to decline shortly thereafter. Families moved away, businesses closed. By 1890, the town had been all but abandoned, and by the early 1900s, it had been absorbed into neighboring communities, its name eventually disappearing from maps entirely. But stories persist. Hikers in the Green Mountains occasionally report coming across stone foundations in an overgrown clearing, all that remains of Blackwood Hollow. Those who linger after sunset speak of children's voices calling from the woods, of cold spots that appear suddenly, of the overwhelming sense of being watched, and somewhere perhaps the Gradys still exist in some form. For if Jeremiah's experiments yielded any results, if he discovered even a fraction of what he sought in his quest for immortality, then something of him may yet endure. A presence lurking at the edges of our world, still seeking, still hungry for that vital energy he believed would grant eternal life. The rural roads of Vermont hold many secrets. Towns that no longer exist. Families whose true histories have been obscured by time. And perhaps in the deepest woods, far from any path, there stands another barn with another floor beneath which lie more innocent souls, victims of a quest that has no end. But that, dear viewers, is a story for another time. For those who find themselves traveling through Vermont's back country, be wary of old properties with new occupants. Be cautious of reclusive families whose children are rarely seen. And should you happen upon an abandoned barn with a floor that seems newer than the walls around it, do not linger. Do not investigate. Simply walk away and count yourself fortunate to have escaped with nothing worse than a tale to tell. As night falls across the green mountains, one might almost hear them, 42 small voices calling from beneath the earth. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in warning. For the Gradys were never found, and perhaps they never will be. Thank you for joining us on the Ghastly Journal. Remember to like, subscribe, and share, but perhaps not after dark. Some stories are best kept to the daylight hours when the shadows can't quite reach you. Until next time, sleep well. And if you hear children's laughter when no children are present, don't follow the sound.